Welcome to the Estate Planning Made Simple podcast by LSPN, one of the nation's largest and best estate planning networks. The information provided on this podcast does not constitute legal advice. All information, content, and materials available on this podcast are for general information purposes only.
All right. Welcome to everybody who's joining us today. We're talking about planning around incapacity today. And a lot of times when we think about incapacity planning, it's one of those words that just sounds kind of foreign. And we're like, well, what exactly is incapacity and why should I care about that, right? I'm fully capable of taking care of myself right now, so why is it important? But the interesting thing is that there's been studies done, and statistically, because of modern medicine, we're living longer. They can keep us alive for longer. Statistically, over 72% of us are going to need long-term care at some point in our lives. And whether that's due to, dementia or Alzheimer's, or maybe it's due to some sort of, short-term injury, recovery sort of process, or maybe it's something else that comes up. If we get to the point where we need long-term care, that's basically the definition of incapacity. And so there are multiple activities of daily living that they consider and they look for to see whether somebody has the capacity of taking care of themselves or whether they need around-the-clock care, skilled nursing care, those sort of things. And so those, 5 activities of daily living include getting in and out of bed, being able to move around, being able to go to the restroom by yourself, being able to feed yourself, being able to put your clothes on your own, and those sort of things. Now, the issue is if you get to the point where you're incapacitated, then, there's physical capacity, obviously, and there's mental capacity. What we're talking mostly about is mental capacity, right? So when you get to the point where you're incapacitated and you're unable to make decisions for yourself or manage your own affairs or be able to, handle things on your own, then as an adult, nobody else is able to step in and make those decisions for you automatically. And in order to empower somebody to make those decisions, you need to have proper documents in writing, or you need to be able to have a legal authority that you would receive through a guardianship or a conservatorship process, which has to go through the court system. And every state's, system is a little bit different. It's easier in some states to get that, harder in others. Sometimes it can take a long time. It can be expensive. It can cause a lot of stress on the family. And so ultimately, it's something that with a little bit of planning can be avoided. So there's 2 sides to planning around incapacity. If you get to the point where you're going to be incapacitated and you need somebody to assist you, you need to first consider the legal ramifications, the legal documents that you need to have in place in order to empower somebody that you trust to take over things in that moment. And then the second part is, how are you going to pay for care? If you need long-term care, around-the-clock skilled nursing care, that adds up. The cost can get very expensive very quick, right? On average, I think the average cost across the United States for 1 year of skilled nursing care is somewhere around $58,000. And of course, if you're in some markets, it's going to be more expensive. If you're in other markets, it's going to be less expensive. But the idea is that when you're paying for around-the-clock care, those are costs that in addition to your regular living expenses, in addition to paying, if you have a house, you're going to keep the house, for example, you need to pay the mortgage. If you have a place that you're going to be there full time with assisted living or whatnot, then you might not have to pay the mortgage or pay rent, but you're still going to have, expenses for food, and you're still going to have expenses for, clothes and transportation and all kinds of other things that are regular expenses. And especially if you're married and you have a spouse, or maybe you have other family members that are dependents that you're taking care of, those expenses don't change. So these costs are on top of your regular living expenses. Does that make sense? And so the more that you have saved up for the future, for retirement and those sort of needs, the more security you may have in being able to pay for those expenses yourself. But the reality is that the farther ahead that you plan, the more prepared you will be when you get to the point that you become incapacitated, if that point comes. So we'll touch on that in just a second about the ways that you can pay for care, and we'll dive just in the shallow depths today, but then we'll revisit the conversation a little bit, in future podcasts as well. So when it comes to the legal side of planning, having the right documents in place, the basic documents that we recommend for practically everybody, but especially when you're getting to the point where you may have diminished capacity, or when you're getting to the age that it may come soon to have diminished capacity. And when I say the age that affects you, we have some clients that have early onset Alzheimer's, that as early as their early 40s, they end up, having symptoms of memory loss and, reduced abilities and so on that they have to deal with. So it's not unique only to old people, right? It can be for younger families as well. But most of the time, when you get to your 60s is really the time when you're going to be worried about these sort of things coming up more regularly, right? And so the basic documents that you would want to have in place are a financial power of attorney and a healthcare power of attorney. And on the financial side, your financial power of attorney will address everything from managing assets like your, real estate, investments, insurances, anything like that, to all the day-to-day decisions that also have to take place. So somebody has to pay the bills. Somebody has to open the mail. Somebody has to, make decisions as to whether you keep your Netflix subscription or not, right? All of those sort of things can be governed by a power of attorney. And then on the medical side, for your being, your health and well-being, a medical power of attorney or a healthcare proxy or, a directive for healthcare purposes. Every state has a different name for it, but it's a document that you empower somebody to make medical decisions for you. That document is extremely important because if you need somebody to make decisions as to your person, whether you have surgery or not, whether they keep you alive by artificial means or not, whether you receive certain medication or other medication, what doctor you see, right? All of those sort of decisions are governed by your medical power of attorney. So again, if you don't have these documents, then somebody that, hopefully that cares about you, would go to court to get that authority, right? So the court would grant a guardianship or a conservatorship. Guardianship in some states is known as a conservatorship over the person. In some states, the conservatorship is known as a guardianship or a guardian over the estate, right? But the idea is the same. There's two parts. One is over you, and the other is over your stuff, your belongings, your assets, right? And so in order for somebody to have authority over that, they would have to get a court order. And again, it can be expensive. It can take a long time. It can be very stressful, right? So that's the first consideration. Those are simple documents to get in place. There's really no excuse for why any adult wouldn't have those. But unfortunately, a lot of us procrastinate to the point where, we're in our 60s or 70s and they come in and meet with us and they say, well, I've never done this before. I don't have a power of attorney. Or they're, stuck in the hospital with COVID or with some other, disease or illness, or like a client that just called us the other day that has cancer, terminal cancer. And they said, well, we don't have any documents, and my daughter needs a power of attorney right now because the bills are piling up and the bank's threatening foreclosure, and we need her to be able to make decisions, right? So these documents are extremely important, and it's important to have them in place before a diagnosis of incapacity, because if you get diagnosed, now it's too late to be able to sign documents on your own, right? And so you have to go to court to get that permission. So that's the legal side. Now let's talk a little bit about the financial side. In addition to having the legal documents for somebody to make decisions and to handle things for you, you also have to prepare for if you do need long-term care, if you're going to be incapacitated or you need assistance during incapacity, how are you going to pay for that? And there are really three options. So first, you can pay for it yourself, and paying for it yourself can be quite expensive, right? And on average, somebody who needs long-term care in the case of incapacity, they're going to need, men on average need it for about 2.5 years, right? And so it may be less, it may be more. Some people need it for a long time because they stay alive for a long time. I have one of my clients that has early onset Alzheimer's. They became incapacitated very early in life. They've had it for 8 years now, and they're still kicking and they're still healthy, and they may live for another 12, 15, 20 years. Who knows? He's in his mid 50s. And so, there's a good chance that he's going to be around for a while. And then the other side of it is, the family may need that money, right? And so if it's all spent down, then, you might not be able to afford care otherwise, right? And so it becomes very expensive. But there are methods to be able to self-pay where you can stretch your funds, put it into a location, a product, options that will use the same money. And instead of $100,000 buying $100,000 of care, that $100,000 could buy $200,000, $400 of care, right? $200,000 or $400,000 of care, I should say. So, planning ahead helps give you those opportunities and those options to stretch your money and earmark funds specifically for that need if the time comes and if you have the resources to be able to self-pay. The second option is to have insurance that will pay for you. So if you have life insurance, nowadays, life insurance can double as your long-term care insurance as well. You can get a policy. I actually have a policy for my business succession planning, another topic that we hit on last few podcasts, and we'll hit on again. But my policy doubles as a disability policy, a life insurance policy, and a long-term care policy, right? So if I get to the point where I need long-term care, then my policy will pay out early to provide for that care, right? And so that's an easy way, especially if you're young, to be able to address the need to pay for long-term care by having a plan ahead of time that makes the cost minimal, right? You're going to pay for life insurance anyway, might as well use it for long-term care in case you need it, and make sure you have proper coverage. The second type of insurance is what's called standalone long-term care insurance. And when you get standalone long-term care insurance, what you're doing is you're buying a pool of money that will pay for long-term care at a discounted cost. And so you're paying it in premiums, and then that money accumulates, and you have a pool of money then that will cover your long-term care needs. So if you need long-term care, there's an exclusion period that you won't be able to qualify for the benefits until after that amount of time. Usually it's like 90 days, maybe 120 days. But it's a minimal amount of time that you have to wait so that they can confirm that you're going to be able to qualify for the benefits. And in the meantime, all of us, if you're on Medicare will cover 90 days of long-term care over your lifetime. And so if you need long-term care, skilled nursing care, around-the-clock care, your Medicare will cover up to 90 days. But after that, then it goes away, right? And you have to have other solutions to pay for your care. And so, an exclusion period of 90 days, then it would kick in, and your insurance is going to cover a certain amount per month for a certain amount of time. So maybe it'll cover you for 2 years at $5,000 a month, or maybe it's adjusted for inflation, so it covers more with time, right? But that's how long-term care insurance works. The problem with traditional long-term care insurance is that it's a use it or lose it proposition. That means that if you need it and you end up using it and you qualify to be able to use it, then you get the benefits from it. But if you don't need it, or if you end up not using it, or if you die early, or if maybe your spouse needs it, but they're not on the policy, then you don't get any value from it. And when you pass away, it can't be passed on to anybody else. It doesn't reimburse you for what you paid in. And so generally speaking, you lose all of the money that you put into it if it's not used, right? And so that's the downside. And because of the way that long-term care insurance, standalone long-term care insurance is structured, it can be quite expensive. And so, putting in $400, $800, maybe even over $1,000 a month, it might not be an option for some people. And the other thing is, if you get too far along, and you do have a diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's or something like that, that would indicate that you're going to need long-term care in the future, then you won't be able to qualify for these sort of policies. And so again, if you can get it in place ahead of time, or if it's a benefit that your employer offers, that's a great option as well. Otherwise, other options are available. And the third type of insurance that you can put in place for long-term care to have insurance pay for it would be a type of policy that you pay in a lump sum of money, and then that gives you a pool of coverage for long-term care. And it might give you double, it might give you triple, it might give you 4 times, just like we were talking about for self-care or self-paying. But in this case, it's an insurance, and the insurance will pay for a certain amount of care that you would need in the future. So again, the 3 options are you can pay for it yourself, you can have insurance to pay for it, and option number 3 is you can have the government pay for it. The problem with having the government pay for your long-term care is that it's a program called Medicaid. And in order to qualify for Medicaid, you can only have $2,000 of value to your name. And I say that, but actually in the last couple of years, the federal Medicaid program took away their guidelines. So it's not a specific dollar limit anymore. But most states still kind of adhere to that $2,000 maximum. And so if you have any significant assets, real estate, investments, savings, anything like that, then you won't be able to qualify for Medicaid and have the government pay for your care because you don't meet their guidelines. So in order to qualify for Medicaid, there are options that we can set up ahead of time to separate your assets so that they won't be counted under Medicaid guidelines. There are certain assets that are exempt that won't be counted anyway, like personal property, for example. And then there are other assets that will be counted, but they might not disqualify you from being able to receive benefits. So if you have a personal residence, the Medicaid department's not going to force you to sell your home in order to qualify, but when you pass away, they will collect from your home for everything that they expended on you, right? And so if you want to protect your assets from having to be spent down or from being collected against, there are ways for us to set up a structure that will separate those assets from your estate so that they're not counted and you can receive benefits, but your family can also keep the value of those assets. And the key to doing that, generally speaking, is to do it 5 years ahead of time, because the Medicaid department can look back 5 years and see anything that you transferred and see if it was a disqualifying transfer, so then you won't receive benefits. But after 5 years, it's completely protected, right? So there are ways to plan around that. There is also what we call crisis planning. So if you get to the point where you are needing Medicaid to kick in, but you have too many assets, then we can help manage the spend down or look at preserving the most amount of value as possible for the family, but at the same time, prepare you to receive Medicaid immediately, right? So those are just a general framework. We'll revisit this topic and talk more about Medicaid in the future. We appreciate you kind of tuning in. At this point, if anybody has any questions on, again, what should you be planning for in terms of incapacity from the legal side, the document side, and then also from the financial side, we're happy to address those questions at this time. All right, we do have one question. The question is and I'm just going to paraphrase because it's a specific scenario, but if you have a loved one or a family member that's in the hospital and they want to set up documents so that somebody can make decisions for them, then how do you know whether they can do it? So the answer is, there's something called testamentary capacity, and there's also something called contractual capacity. From a legal perspective, in order for somebody to sign valid legal documents, they have to have capacity. And so the standard for testamentary capacity is pretty low. Basically, they have to recognize who they are, right? So they have to be self-aware, know who they are. They have to know more or less what they own, right? So if they know that maybe they don't live in the house anymore, but they know that they own a house, and they know that they have a little bit of savings, and maybe they have a 401k, and they're more or less aware of their belongings. And they have to be aware of what the law calls the natural objects of their affection, which would be friends and family, right? So if they're aware of, I have 4 kids and my kids' names are these, and, one of the kids lives in Ohio and one of them lives in California, that sort of thing. So if they meet those standards, then the likelihood is that they will meet testamentary capacity. And if they meet testamentary capacity, then they would be able to execute, for example, a will or a power of attorney or a healthcare directive and be able to give that permission. Now, if there is a diagnosis already of incapacity, then that's a barrier, because in order for documents to be accepted, there can't be anything that would intervene and say, well, the signature might not be valid, right? And so if you're thinking about having a loved one, parent, sibling, somebody that's going to go and get a doctor's diagnosis as to whether they have capacity, but you need them to sign documents to give you authority so that you can help with things, it may be best to go through the process of doing those documents before the diagnosis, or if you have a clear diagnosis that they're not, incapacitated yet, then do the documents quickly, because the time may come when they can no longer sign, and then you have to go to court. So hopefully that's helpful. Any other questions? All right. Well, I don't know whether any other questions will pop up, but we appreciate everybody for tuning in today. And of course, as always, we're going to be continuing these conversations. Next week, the topic is related to estate planning and the transfer of assets again, just like we're kind of rotating through these topics week by week. And we appreciate you tuning in today for Planning Around Incapacity. We'll have this on multiple podcasting sites. Like, subscribe, follow us, and that way you can be involved with future conversations.
This has been Estate Planning Made Simple, a podcast by LSPN. Join us next week on Clubhouse and on all major podcasting platforms.